The winter rain fell in sheets across the muddy hills of Italy, turning the battlefield into a nightmare of sucking clay and freezing water that soaked through every layer of clothing. Staff Sergeant Vincent Romano crouched in a shell crater, his Thompson submachine gun pressed against his chest, listening to the distinctive crack of German MG-42 machine guns tearing the air apart somewhere in the darkness ahead. It was January 1944, and the Allied advance through Italy had ground to a bloody crawl against the German defensive lines. Monte Cassino loomed in the distance, its ancient monastery perched on the hilltop like a medieval fortress, and between Romano's position and that objective lay 3 miles of hell disguised as Italian countryside. Romano's squad, what was left of it, huddled in the crater around him. 12 men had started the patrol that morning. 7 remained. The others were dead or wounded, scattered across the muddy slopes behind them, and Romano knew that before this night was over, more names would be added to the casualty list that seemed to grow longer with each passing day. "Sarge," whispered Private Danny Walsh, a kid from Brooklyn who still had acne scars on his face and shouldn't have been old enough to vote, much less carry a rifle into combat. "We're pinned. We gotta fall back." Romano shook his head, rain dripping from his helmet. "Can't. Battalion needs that radio relay station knocked out before dawn. If we don't take it out, the Germans will direct artillery fire on our entire advance. Thousands of men will die." "Then thousands of men will die," Walsh said flatly, "because we're 7 guys facing what sounds like at least a platoon up there. And we got maybe an hour before daylight gets us all killed." Romano knew Walsh was right. This was a suicide mission dressed up as a tactical objective. Some colonels safely behind the lines had looked at a map and decided that a squad could infiltrate German positions, destroy a radio relay station, and extract before dawn. On a map, with colored pins and clean lines, it probably looked reasonable. But maps didn't account for mud that swallowed men to their knees, or machine gun nests covering every approach, or the simple fact that soldiers were human beings who could bleed and die and feel terror. But Romano also knew that Walsh was wrong about one thing. The mission still mattered. Somewhere out there in the darkness, thousands of American soldiers were preparing for a dawn assault. If that German radio station remained operational, enemy artillery would rain down on them with devastating accuracy. Men who'd survived Salerno and Anzio would die because one sergeant and his squad had decided their own lives were worth more than the mission. Romano had learned something during his 2 years of combat. Courage wasn't the absence of fear. Courage was being absolutely terrified and doing the job anyway, because other men's lives depended on you. "We're going," he said quietly. "Check your ammunition. We move in 5 minutes." The approach to the German position was a textbook example of everything that could go wrong in night combat. They moved in single file through a vineyard that had been turned into a moonscape by artillery. The grapevines torn and shredded. The earth churned into a porridge of mud and shrapnel. Romano could hear German voices ahead, speaking in low tones, and the occasional clank of equipment that told him the enemy was alert and waiting. They were 50 yards from the relay station, a fortified farmhouse on a small rise, when the first shots rang out. Private Walsh went down immediately. taking a round through the thigh that made him scream in pain and surprise. The German machine guns opened up a heartbeat later, tracers cutting through the darkness like horizontal lightning, and Romano's world exploded into chaos. "Covering fire!" Romano shouted, bringing his Thompson up and emptying half a magazine toward the farmhouse. "Get Walsh to cover!" Two of his men dragged Walsh backward while the others laid down suppressing fire. But Romano could see it was hopeless. The Germans had the high ground, perfect fields of fire, and enough firepower to cut down anything that moved. His squad was trapped in the open, 40 yards from the objective and 100 yards from any meaningful cover. That's when Romano made the decision that would define the rest of his life, however long that turned out to be. "Fall back," he screamed at his squad. "Get Walsh out of here. I'll cover you." "Sarge, that's an order. Move." Romano watched his remaining men drag Walsh toward the rear, then turned back toward the German position and began to run, not away from the enemy, but toward them, directly toward the machine guns that were trying to kill him. It was insane. It defied every tactical principle he'd ever learned. But it was also the only play he had left. If he could draw German fire, keep them focused on him instead of his retreating squad, maybe his men would make it out alive. And if he could somehow, impossibly, reach that farmhouse and destroy the radio equipment, then his death would at least mean something. The first bullet hit him before he'd covered 10 yards. It punched through his left shoulder with an impact that felt like being hit with a baseball bat, spinning him partially around. Romano kept running. The second and third bullets hit almost simultaneously, one grazing his ribs and the other tearing through his right thigh. His leg buckled, and he went down hard in the mud. Romano forced himself back to his feet and kept moving, his Thompson firing in short, controlled bursts, even as blood soaked through his uniform. The Germans must have thought he was leading a charge, that a whole platoon was about to come screaming out of the darkness behind him. Their machine guns concentrated their fire on his position, tracers converging on him like deadly fireflies, and Romano felt more impacts. His left arm, his side, his other leg. Each hit felt like a separate punch, but the adrenaline flooding his system was keeping the pain at a distance, letting him function even as his body accumulated damage that should have killed him. He was 20 yards from the farmhouse when he threw his first grenade. It sailed through a window and detonated with a flash that lit up the interior, followed by screams and the sudden cessation of one of the machine guns. Romano stumbled forward, firing his Thompson with one hand, while his left arm dangled useless at his side. More bullets found him, his right shoulder, his abdomen, his left leg again. Romano could feel his strength draining away with every heartbeat, could feel the wet heat of blood soaking his uniform in a dozen places. But he was close now, so close, and if he could just reach that farmhouse, just destroy that radio equipment, then maybe it would be enough. A German soldier appeared in the doorway, rifle raised, but Romano was faster. The Thompson barked twice, and the German went down. Romano dragged himself through the doorway, his legs barely supporting his weight now, and found himself in a room that stank of cordite and blood. The radio equipment sat in the corner, intact and operational, its tubes glowing with power. 3 German soldiers lay dead around it, victims of Romano's grenade. But two more were still alive, scrambling for their weapons, and Romano knew he had maybe seconds left before they killed him. He emptied the last of his Thompson's magazine into the radio equipment, watching with savage satisfaction as bullets tore through vacuum tubes and wiring, as sparks flew and components shattered. One of the German soldiers got his rifle up and fired, the bullet taking Romano in the chest and dropping him to his knees. Romano pulled his last grenade from his belt, yanked the pin, and threw it at the remaining radio equipment. Then he collapsed forward onto the stone floor, his vision tunneling, his hearing fading to a high-pitched ringing. He was dying. He knew that. No one could survive this many gunshot wounds, this much blood loss, but through the growing darkness, he saw the grenade detonate, saw the radio equipment disintegrate in a ball of fire and shrapnel, and he thought, I did it. The mission is complete. Vincent Romano should have died on that farmhouse floor in January 1944. By every medical metric, every statistical probability, he should have bled out in minutes. The German soldiers who found him 15 minutes later couldn't believe he was still breathing. They counted 47 separate gunshot wounds on his body, through his arms, legs, torso, and one that had grazed his skull. He'd lost more than half his blood volume. His left lung was collapsed, his right leg was shattered, and his intestines had been perforated in 3 places. But Romano's heart kept beating. Somehow, impossibly, he clung to life. The Germans, out of a mixture of respect and disbelief, rendered first aid rather than executing him. A German medic who'd worked in a Munich hospital before the war looked at Romano's wounds and whispered, "Unmöglich," impossible. But he bandaged what he could, gave Romano morphine, and had him evacuated to a field hospital. Romano spent the next 6 months drifting in and out of consciousness, his body fighting a desperate battle against infection, blood loss, and shock. He underwent 7 surgeries. Twice, doctors prepared to amputate his right leg. 3 times his heart stopped and had to be restarted. The medical staff who treated him started calling him the miracle, because nothing else could explain his survival. He woke fully for the first time in March, in a prisoner of war hospital somewhere in northern Italy. An American doctor, himself a POW, sat beside his bed and looked at him with something approaching awe. "Sergeant Romano," the doctor said quietly, "you shouldn't be alive. I've been a surgeon for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone survive what you survived. Do you remember what happened?" Romano's throat was too dry to speak. He nodded slowly. "Your mission," the doctor continued. "The radio station. Did you complete it?" Again, Romano nodded. The doctor's eyes grew wet. "We heard. Your squad made it back and reported what you did. The Germans never called in artillery support during our advance. We estimate you saved somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 American lives that morning." Romano closed his eyes. 2,000 to 3,000 lives. That was the arithmetic of war. One life traded for thousands. It should have felt noble, heroic, meaningful. Instead, it just felt heavy. "Your squad," Romano whispered. "Did they make it?" All 6 men survived. Private Walsh lost his leg, but he lived. "They're calling you a hero back home, Sergeant. They're saying you might get the Medal of Honor." Romano said nothing. Heroes were dead people who'd gotten lucky with their posthumous publicity. He was just a man who'd made a choice in a muddy Italian vineyard and somehow survived it. The war ended while Romano was still in recovery. By the time he was repatriated to the United States in late 1945, his story had spread through the army. Newspapers called him the indestructible soldier. Radio programs dramatized his charge against the German position. Hollywood wanted to make a movie about him. Romano refused all of it. He didn't want to be famous, didn't want to be interviewed, didn't want to relive that night for the entertainment of people who'd never had to make the choices he'd made. He especially didn't want the Medal of Honor, because he knew that medal belonged as much to the 6 men who'd survived and the 5 who hadn't, as it did to him. But the Army insisted, and in September 1945, President Truman personally pinned the Medal of Honor on Romano's chest at a White House ceremony. Romano stood at attention, his body still carrying 47 separate scars, his right leg supported by a brace, and listened to the citation being read. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Staff Sergeant Vincent Romano, despite receiving 47 gunshot wounds, single-handedly destroyed an enemy radio position, drawing enemy fire to protect his squad and enabling the successful advance of his battalion. When it was over, when the photographers had finished and the ceremony had concluded, President Truman pulled Romano aside. "Son," the president said quietly, "I've read your full report. I know you think you were just doing your job, but what you did that night, that wasn't just duty. That was something more. You gave everything you had, expected to die, and somehow lived to tell about it. That's not just heroism, that's grace." Romano thought about that conversation often in the years that followed. Grace. Maybe that's what it was. Not heroism, not nobility, not even courage in the traditional sense. Just grace, the inexplicable mercy that had let him live when by all rights he should have died. He returned to his home in Philadelphia and tried to rebuild a normal life. He married his childhood sweetheart, Mary, who'd waited for him through the war. They had 3 children. He worked as a machinist at the Navy Yard, a job that let him use his hands and required no speeches, no interviews, no reliving of the worst night of his life. But the wounds never really healed. Not the physical ones that ached in cold weather and made his right leg drag when he was tired, and certainly not the psychological ones. Romano had nightmares for years, waking up in the darkness with the sound of German machine guns in his ears and the feeling of bullets tearing through his flesh. He couldn't watch war movies. He couldn't talk about Italy. He kept the Medal of Honor in a drawer and never displayed it. His children grew up knowing their father had been in the war, but understanding almost nothing about what he'd done. It wasn't until they were adults, until Romano was in his 60s, that they finally convinced him to tell them the story. They sat around his kitchen table one evening in 1983, and Romano, his hair now white, his body bent and scarred but still stubbornly alive, told them about that muddy vineyard in Italy, about the choice he'd made, about running toward the machine guns instead of away from them. "Why?" his youngest daughter asked when he finished. "Why did you do it? Why didn't you just retreat with your squad?" Romano was quiet for a long time. "Because," he said finally. Someone had to, and it was my job to be that someone. The mission mattered more than I did. Those thousands of men who would have died if the Germans had called in artillery, they mattered more than I did. But you nearly died, his son protested. You were shot 47 times. Romano smiled sadly. Nearly is the important word. I nearly died, but I didn't. And every day since then, I've tried to live in a way that honors all the men who did die, who didn't get the grace I got, who gave everything and never came home. He paused, looking at each of his children in turn. That's what that night taught me. Life is a gift, especially for those of us who came so close to losing it. Every day I've had since January 1944 is borrowed time, and I've tried to spend it well. Vincent Romano died in 1995 at the age of 74, outliving most of his squad and most of his generation. His funeral was attended by the surviving members of his squad, 4 old men who'd served together in Italy and who'd spent 50 years trying to live up to the example their sergeant had set on that muddy hillside. Private Danny Walsh, the Brooklyn kid who'd lost his leg in that vineyard, gave the eulogy. He stood on his prosthetic leg, looking out at the assembled mourners, and said, I've spent 50 years trying to understand what Vince did that night. I've read books about courage. I've talked to psychiatrists. I've thought about it almost every day. And here's what I've concluded. What Vince did wasn't rational. It wasn't even sane. No rational person runs toward machine guns. No sane person keeps fighting after being shot 47 times. But sometimes, in war, the irrational is the only rational choice. Sometimes insane courage is the only thing that makes sense. Vince understood something that night that I didn't. That his life mattered less than the mission. That saving 6 of us and thousands of others was worth dying for. Except he didn't die. He survived, carrying 47 scars for the rest of his life as proof that sometimes the impossible is possible, that sometimes grace intervenes, that sometimes the dead don't stay dead. Vince Romano should have died in Italy in 1944. Instead, he got 51 extra years, years he spent as a husband, a father, a friend, and a reminder that the cost of freedom is measured in blood and sacrifice and the willingness to give everything for something larger than yourself. We called him the indestructible soldier, but that was wrong. He was very destructible. He was mortal and fragile and breakable. He just refused to let being shot 47 times stop him from finishing the mission. That's not indestructibility. That's something far more impressive. That's humanity at its absolute finest. The story of Vincent Romano's charge into machine gun fire, his survival despite 47 gunshot wounds, and his destruction of the German radio station became legendary in military circles. It's taught at West Point as an example of leadership under fire. It's referenced in Medal of Honor citations for other soldiers who displayed extraordinary courage. It's become part of the mythology of World War II, proof that individual actions can change the course of history. But for those who knew Romano personally, the real story wasn't the night he nearly died. It was the 51 years he lived afterward, carrying those 47 scars as a reminder of what he'd given and what he'd been given in return. He lived with chronic pain, with nightmares, with the weight of survivor's guilt. But he also lived with love, with family, with the knowledge that his sacrifice had mattered. In his final days, as cancer finally accomplished what 47 German bullets couldn't, Romano was asked by a journalist if he had any regrets about that night in Italy. Romano thought for a long moment before answering. "I regret that I had to make that choice," he said finally. "I regret that war exists, that young men have to die, that the world is organized in a way that makes such sacrifices necessary. But do I regret what I did? No. I did what needed doing, and somehow, by grace or luck or divine intervention, I survived to tell about it. But here's what I want people to remember. I'm not special. Every soldier who's ever gone to war has faced moments where they had to choose between themselves and the mission, between survival and duty. Most of them made the same choice I did. The only difference is that I survived, and most of them didn't. So when people talk about my courage, I want them to remember all the men who showed the same courage, but whose names are carved on monuments instead of printed in newspapers. I was shot 47 times and finished the mission, but millions of other men were shot once or twice or not at all, and finished their missions too. Their stories just don't sound as dramatic, but their sacrifices were every bit as real, every bit as meaningful, every bit as worthy of being remembered. Those were Vincent Romano's last words about his service in World War II. He died 3 days later, surrounded by his family, his body finally giving out after carrying the burden of those 47 scars for more than half a century. At his funeral, the army sent an honor guard. They folded the flag that had draped his coffin and presented it to his widow. They played taps while 4 old men, the last survivors of Romano's squad, stood at attention and wept openly for the sergeant, who'd saved their lives and somehow lived to grow old with them. And in a cemetery in Philadelphia, on a simple headstone that gives no hint of the extraordinary life it marks, there is only this inscription: Vincent Romano, 1921-1995, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army Medal of Honor, recipient. He finished the mission. Sometimes, in military circles, when someone faces an impossible situation, when the odds are overwhelming and survival seems impossible, soldiers will say, "Time to pull a Romano." It means time to do what needs doing, regardless of the cost. Time to put the mission first. Time to show the kind of courage that defies all logic and all probability. Because Vincent Romano proved something important that night in a muddy Italian vineyard, that the human spirit, when tested to its absolute limit, can endure the unendurable and achieve the impossible. That 47 bullets aren't enough to stop a man who knows what he's fighting for. That sometimes, just sometimes, the heroes don't die. They survive to carry their scars as proof that grace exists, that sacrifice matters, and that one person really can change history. He was shot 47 times, and he still finished the mission. And in doing so, he proved that courage isn't about being unbreakable. It's about being broken and continuing anyway, because other people's lives depend on you. That's the legacy of Vincent Romano, not the medals or the headlines or the dramatic retellings, but the simple, profound truth that duty and sacrifice and courage still matter, even when especially when they cost us everything we have to give.